I'd just like to start the panel by acknowledging the traditional owners, past and present, and those emerging. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on stolen land, and this is Aboriginal land, always was, always will be. So thank you for joining us today. I have to say, I did get offered a joint last night at about 1 a.m. at a party, at which I had to go, oh, I really would like to, but I can't, because I'm driving to MardiGrass tomorrow and I will get tested. I was kind of disappointed they didn't test me. I almost wanted to go knock on their cars and go, get the fuck out here and test me, because I gave up a joint last night to drive here. We are talking about cannabis law reform campaigns. Today, before I just hand over to the speakers and the questions, we'll sort of have a chat up here, and then you have the opportunity then to ask questions. Really exciting what's happened in Western Australia. It's exciting having this conversation that we're having today. But I was looking at it from a point of view, from a social point of view, that's how I, sort of like to, it's a weird frame. I go, it's, cannabis, it's a medicine, it's a textile, it's a plastic, it's a biofuel, it's a food, it's a building product, it's fun, and it's illegal. What the fuck? We don't need a gas-led recovery, we need a pot-led recovery. You can use that. I thought of that in the car on the way here, and I thought, wow, such an amazing, very stigmatised, amazing plant that we have at our fingertips, literally, here today. So once again, thank you very much for being here, and I'd like to welcome immediately to my right, we have Cate Faehrmann. Cate is Greens MP for New South Wales Greens, and Cate, earlier this year, she introduced the cannabis legislation bill to the upper house of the New South Wales Parliament. We'll talk a little bit more about that bill as we go on and what that meant. So do welcome Cate. Thank you, Cate. And you do realise I'm not going to read your whole bios, because that sounds like a eulogy, doesn't it? So I'm just going to do a little bit, and so if I miss something that's key, do let me know. I'd also like to welcome, I've got to find my right page, Dr. Brian Walker. He is actually part of the West Australian Legalise Cannabis Party, who was voted in as well. So thank you very much for coming here today, Dr. Brian. And of course, we also have, look at my pages here, we have Emma Sinclair. No, we don't. We do, actually. We have Emma Sinclair. There you are. I'm getting confused. Should have had that joint, actually. Would have been good for my fluid thinking. So I'm having to clench my bum on this chair too, because at the point I feel like I'm about to go down the hill. So do watch out. So sorry, Emma Sinclair. And Emma is here on behalf of Fiona Patten from the Reason Party. She's the National Secretary and the State Manager of the Reason Party. So thank you very much for coming today. And to my right here, we have Sophia Moermond. Sophia also is from the Legalise Cannabis Party in Western Australia, a very newly elected MP, and how exciting perhaps that progressive Labor government that David was talking about could almost happen with you two giving it a bit of a push. With a bit of help from the Greens, who knows what you could achieve in Western Australia. And of course, immediately to my left, we have Dr. Alex Wodak, an incredible campaigner and a man that's done so much in giving people liberty, freedom and dignity in this space, who's very active in what he talks about around prohibition. So please welcome Dr. Alex Wodak. So thank you. We are here to talk about recent cannabis law reform in obviously Victoria, New South Wales and Western Australia. But before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about how you came to be in this space, because as David Hilpin was talking about in the previous session, as we talked about, it's a dangerous space to be in sometimes politically, for what it can mean to you professionally, and to actually stand up and speak out, you're going to take a lot of flack. So I'd like to hear really from each of you, and not, fairly succinctly, why you have stepped into the arena with a voice around law reform, around drug law reform.
Okay, so the most recent thing that I can relate that to is the fact that my mum has gone into care, and she requires CBD oil to feel better. So she was diagnosed with Parkinsonia She's 82 years old. She's quite frail. Her body is very rigid and uncomfortable, and she has some pain and trouble sleeping. And the CBD oil makes a real difference for her. It is an incredible drama, though, to get it in the first place, and it's about $1,000 per year in doctor's fees to keep it, plus on top of that about $250 per month to actually keep her supply up. So it helps her. I think it's ridiculously expensive. She's very lucky that she can afford it, but I know there are many, many people out there who are being pushed into criminal behaviours simply because they want to feel better, they want to cope with life, they don't want to be stuck on opiates, for instance, you know, and it's being kept out of the reach for a lot of people due to financial reasons. I think that's unfair.
Thank you so much, Sophia. Thank you. And we are passing the mic around, so we are building immunity this weekend.
We sometimes have like little covers over them.
Do you?
Like during COVID, yeah, like little fluffy covers that you took off and then replaced. But if you like keep it and you take it around and you put it on the next microphone you use.
Oh no, you know when you wipe off the top, it just looks really wrong.
Yeah, we've just got to keep doing that. Basically, so for me, so it's a part of the Greens platform, has been a part of the Greens platform for quite some time here in New South Wales. We've got a Legalise Cannabis platform. For me personally, drugs have been a pretty big part of my life, to be brutally honest, and big part of my life in university, big part of like basically pretty much every single person I know and I have ever talked to. So it's just a social justice thing, right? It's like just because people choose to take a certain drug, they're persecuted and their life is completely messed up. So that's kind of it. And I've got, because of my personal experience, I've spoken out about taking illegal drugs, and I just think as an MP, I can bring a kind of really, you know, honest perspective to this debate. You know, I didn't say that I didn't inhale. I kind of said I took a shitload of drugs, and who knows kind of what the current situation is.
You can keep that now,
Thanks.
Cate.
Yeah.
Alex?
I hope the Murdoch.
I was very involved in the efforts to try and slow or preferably stop the spread of HIV among people who inject drugs and from them to the rest of the community from the mid-1980s. And I was working in what was clearly the national epicenter of the HIV epidemic in Australia, and we knew already very quickly that if the epidemic spread rapidly among people who inject drugs, it would then spread rapidly from them to the general population, and there'd be, in both cases, amongst the smaller community and the larger community, many deaths, a lot of misery, a lot of social and economic costs. So it was absolutely critical to win that battle, and it was clear very quickly that getting out clean needles and syringes to people who inject drugs was fundamental, very urgent. And it became very clear that the main reason that we were being stopped was because of drug prohibition. So it took me about a year to work all that out. And then one day I was sitting in my office and it was just blindingly obvious, and I realised I had to devote the rest of my life to drug law reform, and I became immersed in reading about it. My work took me to a lot of countries, mainly low and middle income countries, dealing with these kinds of issues. And I had some incredible experiences meeting high-level people, low-level people, everyone in between, including a very senior official in the US State Department in Washington, D.C. And I spent a night in a shooting gallery in Williamsburg, Brooklyn in New York, watching 4 people inject speedballs of heroin cocaine. So all of these experiences different kinds of evidence, research evidence, sort of watching these sort of things and talking to people, told me this is a very powerful issue. I was in a position I could help change, accelerate change, and it's a slow process. You've got to be very patient. You've got to be very energetic and creative. So here we are, all these years later, almost 4 decades later, and we're now starting to get somewhere. So I'll say more about that if you want me to, but that's why I'm here, really.
Thank you, Alex. And Brian?
I think the main reason that I'm involved in this is because I'm angry. I've been involved in attempting to help people regain wellness, also for 4 decades. And it's failed miserably because a lot of obstacles are placed in people's way. So with all respect for orthodox medical colleagues, I, first of all, don't like doctors, and secondly, I detest the system of sickness. Something we share, apparently. Cannabis itself is something I have used, well, not personally, actually. I'm a very minor cannabis user. That's not to say I haven't used this and other substances, but the thing is that I use that to enhance life, not to deal with the multiple problems that people have with which they are then self-medicating because they have been forced to self-medicate, because the doctors, as well-meaning as they are also pretty brain dead. And that results in effective substances being denied to people and effective treatments being denied to people. And that makes me angry because I sit in front of them in their poverty, in their helplessness, in their hopelessness, unable to do anything more than offer what the medical profession permits to be offered. And I think, where do you get off telling other people how to live their lives? So our approach to entering politics was basically to make a difference, because in that one room with one patient in front of you being shat on by the medical authorities if you dare to overstep the boundaries, in politics I can now, thanks be to anything you call holy, I can now call to account those who would dare to damage our health and think they are doing good. So I'm happy with that.
Thank you, Brian. And Emma.
Hello. So probably similarly to Cate, I was a card-carrying member of the Melbourne rave scene in the early 2000s. I probably never thought too much about legalisation, though, or decriminalisation for the substance I was using. Being a fairly privileged white member of society, I had no issues with the law, no run-ins that really made me ever question what I was doing. Where I probably started to think more about drug law reform, I do a lot of work and have done historically with organisations that support at-risk women, particularly an organisation in St Kilda that supports street-based sex workers, many of whom have very complex AOD issues, and just watched the number of, predominantly women, but watched how these people that were already marginalised, stigmatised because of the choices that they had made about how to earn an income, were then further criminalised by the consumption of AOD issues. And that's, I guess, what led me to the Reason Party and what led me to become very passionate about drug law reform, because the cost of criminalisation is not proportional to the level of harm it's causing to the wider community. There are better ways to invest in mental health and support and early intervention. So, that's sort of where I came through.
Thank you very much, Emma, and thank you for touching base with us. One of the points you brought up then, Brian, was, I guess, a little bit around, morality is so often a key theme in the conservative approach to drug taking, as David touched on before as well. But in what is, I guess, what hampers real reform. But with the advent of, at least in different states, some authorised, sort of doctors that can actually then medically prescribe. And as we know, we don't have drug driving laws yet that match those, the freedom of getting a prescription. But what is it in that sense? is there a shift in the morality? Is it immoral then, if you're using a moral imperative as a part of prohibition, then is it immoral to withhold medications that help people? Is there a sense, talking to that, is that part, can that be an argument towards law reform?
I'm sure Alex can comment on that too, but this actually really makes me homicidal. We, for example, I have worn an army uniform. In a very minor way, I was never called to service. It was a reserve. It was 7 years. But I have a father who served as a fighter pilot in Burma and whose morals passed on to me. And I see in our armed forces, the men and women are sent abroad to face bullets and bombs and to show courage in the face of the enemy on our behalf. And we expect them to show courage, but when they come back shattered in mind and body, we then deny them the treatment that they deserve and need to restore themselves. Part of my issues with morality in medicine is that we happily make people addicted to non-essential drugs. Benzodiazepines, for example, the 10-year management of PTSD in a service person is miserable, perhaps 5% management. Whereas with things like MDMA and psychological counselling, we can get with a 1 or 50% cure. But we haven't got the courage to allow that to carry on. And so you talk about morality, I call that highly immoral. And that's standard in our society. The immorality isn't on our part of managing cannabis, it's on the people who insist on a status quo where people can be put with their backs to the wall and allowed to die a miserable death, and we think it's okay. That I consider immoral.
Thank you very much, Brian. I guess, before we move to what's happening in the States for law reform, it's looking at the health impacts of prohibition. And I guess, Alex, you've seen firsthand. Would you like to speak a little bit to what you've seen of the harms of prohibition?
Well, as I already mentioned, it was clear as daylight that drug prohibition was accelerating the spread of HIV infection among and from people who inject drugs. That was apparent decades ago, and that experience was echoed in many other countries around the world and is still taking place. We still do far too little to, not we in Australia, but I'm talking about globally now, we do far too little in far too many countries to slow the spread of HIV, which would be readily preventable. So much less money is spent on harm reduction for people who inject drugs around the world. We've had a lot of successes. In Australia, HIV has been kept under good control among people who inject drugs. In most parts of Asia, home to half the world's population, the same. But in Central Asia, in Eastern Europe, in Russia, and the Middle East, it's pretty miserable. And one of the things I think we should be very mindful of in terms of cannabis law reform is that the insanity of our cannabis laws are echoed with drug prohibition generally. It's not, cannabis law reform is not unique, it's just part of the general irrational response to drugs. And more recently we've had campaigns about pill testing and the ridiculous rejection time after time after time when experts have called for pill testing. We're losing young lives, and now we also have a debate about vaping, where Australia is the most hostile of all the high-income countries. We are the most hostile to vaping, which isn't perfect, but it is certainly much less harmful than smoking, and helps a lot of people to quit. In Australia and around the world, it's the most popular and the most effective way of quitting. And Australia not only rejects it, but is also the only high-income country to require a medical prescription for the liquid nicotine for vaping. So don't think about this as being unusual. And also, outside the area of drug policy, remember also the many social issues that we have handled so badly for so long. We've got 4 women on this panel, and most of those women in most jobs in Australia would be paid less than men. How can that be justified? It can't be. It's been like that for decades. Where's the progress in that issue? The issue of homosexual law reform was mentioned in the previous panel, previous discussion by David Halpin. First decriminalisation of homosexuality was 1973. It wasn't until 2017 that we had marriage equality in Australia. So we have look at the issue of the social policy relating to First Nation Australians. Again, it's indefensible what we are doing. So there are many, many areas where we have to recognise that a lot has to change. A lot has to change within drug policy, especially with cannabis, but also many other issues where we are badly stuck in Australia and where things really need to move.
I'll just say from a health perspective.
Thanks, Alex.
Clap Alex first. I think from a health perspective, the fact that we just have so many people, and I think Brian touched on it, but taking prescription drugs for just so many conditions that cannabis can treat so much better without the side effects is criminal. Like, that's immoral. Like, just recently I had a shoulder injury and I was like prescribed, I had dislocated fractured shoulder, really, really fucking painful thing. And I was prescribed like endone, didn't help, and it just sent me, like if anybody who's taken heavy opioids like that, was just like horrendous. Plus Panadine plus a bunch of stuff anyway. So like a couple of months, just excruciating pain. I'm sure a heap of you understand what excruciating pain is, but it wasn't until, like literally in this part of the world, somebody said to me, here, why don't you just try CBD oil? And I was like, oh my God, like within 10 minutes, I had these prescription drugs that basically didn't touch the sides. 10 minutes, CBD oil, rubbed it, took it was like just incredible. So yeah, it's just totally outrageous how much we have just pharmaceutical companies, which again, I think David Halpern spoke about before, but the outrageous lobbying and the stranglehold they have on our health system is outrageous.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. I guess in a sense whether it goes parallel or whether it happens, after law reform or it has to precede law reform, is that working in that space of destigmatising and of changing the otherisation of people who use drugs and those substances themselves. Is that a space that you've been working into as well with the West Australian Legalise Cannabis Party, Sophia?
It is certainly something that we're looking at. We're trying to make cannabis mainstream so that stigma does come down. So before I got elected, I spoke to quite a few people, probably 65 plus, and some in that group were too scared to go to their GP to ask for CBD oil. They had concerns around driving, stigma in general, but also were concerned about being able to go overseas and not end up in jail, for instance. And in WA too, we're quite conservative there. I don't know if you're aware of that. And there's a lot of ignorance around cannabis, drug use in general. So when you're talking about cannabis usage, certainly recreationally, I think the visual that a lot of people are getting with that is, a dark room with some dirty mattresses and people with needles hanging out of their arm, and that is.
But even that's a stigmatised image of people who are injecting drug users too, isn't it? Like it's not just cannabis. There is a pervasive otherisation of people who use drugs.
That's right.
which feeds into this.
And everything is straight away associated with addictive behaviour, criminal behaviour, and highly dysfunctional people in society, and that's not necessarily the case.
No.
I mean, a lot of people assume that cannabis, certainly in the 80s, was thought of as the gateway drug. Then some research came out showing that alcohol was the gateway drug. But really, in the end, for most people, trauma is the gateway drug. That's where it starts. And that's when people start to want to medicate. They, try various forms. Antidepressants, they get no joy. Painkillers, analgesics, they don't get a lot of joy of that either. So then they start looking for other solutions.
Yeah, thank you. Cate, could you tell me a little bit about the bill that you put to the Upper House in New South Wales Parliament earlier this year? I'm interested in what the key points of that to share with the audience today. And I guess also how you see how it was received, but the likelihood of actually being able to get that through.
Yeah, cool. So I put a bill to the Upper House a few months ago to legalise cannabis. We have handy flyers that basically outline the points and what the bill will do. But I just address the second bit of your question, which was how it was received, which is kind of really fascinating. There's a bit of a history, I think, with the Greens and drugs and our drugs policy. So back in 2003, I was working for the Greens New South Wales election campaign as media advisor. So it was 2003. It was just before, I think it was like the night of MardiGrass. We were called back in as media advisor at midnight because the Sunday Telegraph had a front page attack on the Greens, basically saying the Greens are wanting to sell ecstasy to kids from street corners, basically. So this was the front page. Alex is nodding. He understands it and remembers it very well. It was a nightmare, and it was a nightmare also because I was at Mardi Gras, like I'd just been to the parade, and anyway, so I had to call that short, come in, basically organise what was a really massive press conference the next day, put out all these kind of messages, basically damage control, right? It was massive. We were 2 weeks out from a state election where we were kind of targeting a lower house seat, which we now have, Balmain. So it was just kind of significant to us. It had a really big impact. So we had lots of people in polling booths coming up to us outside polling booths saying, we were going to vote for you, no way, your drugs thing, blah, blah, blah. So fast forward to 2 years ago when I wrote an opinion piece in the New South Wales Sydney Morning Herald that basically said, I'd taken drugs in my 20s, went out dancing, took a lot of MDMA, understand, just say no, that doesn't work, blah, blah, blah. So did that, really positive response, right, from the media. Incredible. Basically all the journalists on the phone before I got onto air were saying, good on you mate, gosh, everybody we know, it was incredible. So that's positive. Then 2 years later, a Greens MP introduces a bill into the New South Wales Parliament to legalise cannabis. Nothing. Nothing from Murdoch, didn't even touch it. Right, and 2 years ago or 3 years ago as well, the Murdoch media, when we had a federal drugs policy as well through Richard Di Natale when he was the leader. The front page of the Courier Mail ran Greens with crack pipes. Basically, it had Richard doctored, photoshopped front page. Larissa Waters, the Queensland Senator, some of you are from Queensland, I've met quite a few Queenslanders today. Larissa Waters' office received 2 phone calls after the Murdoch media had it front page, 2 phone calls that were good on you, right? So people don't give a shit. So David Halpern was in here before talking about Murdoch media and how bad they are. It's true. But I don't think people are listening to Murdoch anymore, but the politicians still are. So people don't give a shit about what's on the front page, right? So that's one thing. So that's interesting. The reception was really, really good. And I actually had people like, say, Triple M nationwide who were like, good on you, Cate. We want to get you back. We really want to see this. This has to get through. So, like, I think the public sentiment is really there. So just very quickly, I know I just rambled on, but it's really important. So I don't think this is going to pass when it's debated at the end of this year, because as David Halpern said, Labor doesn't support it, Labor doesn't support Legalise, and yeah, we're not going to get it through. But what it will do is drag Labor over and pressure Labor to change their policy at some stage, just like we did with marriage equality, just like we did with dying with dignity, just like we did with abortion law reform. The Greens were kind of 5 to 10 years ahead, basically saying, look, it's not what everybody wants to talk about now, but it's going to happen, so we'll introduce a model bill that future bills can be based upon. And that's what this is. Having said that, please get behind the campaign to legalise it. In 1 minute, what it does is establish a legal framework to essentially kind of create this system to grow and sell cannabis. It establishes a cannabis authority in New South Wales. It legalises the ability to for people to grow plants at home, 6 plants per 2 households, or up to 12 plants per household. It establishes cannabis social clubs where people can, at least 5 people, have a club and they can grow up to 99 plants and kind of sell, give plants out to the members of this club. It provides a way for companies, for people to be able to cultivate and grow cannabis through a kind of body, if you like, that sets the price, that looks at things like labelling, that sets the label will say the strain, you know, the strength, all of that, which is really important. Importantly, it will send information to consumers. It will also ensure that under 18s can't access it. It will ensure that cannabis stores can't be established within 200 metres of a school. All of that stuff, we had to be quite cautious, you can imagine. Right, it's really, really well thought through. We consulted a lot of stakeholders, including doing a big roundtable with cannabis stakeholders, some of whom I've seen here today as well. As I said, it's what I'm trying to do with this is establish, if you like, a public debate that this really full-on scary thing is not so scary at all. In fact, it's going to bring potentially like 666 million, which I thought was pretty weird.
I know, think of the tax.
The devil's weed, no, could we have just made it 665 million? But anyway, it does really great stuff. We're going to distribute these flyers. Yeah, it's the devil's weed. It's going to bring the devil's quantity of millions of dollars into the public purse. That's how bad it is.
Yeah, fantastic. Great work. Thanks, Cate. So, Emma, I'd love to know what's happening in Victoria. So where are you up to with law reform in... It's all right. They'll be ringing. That's the devil ringing for his weed. Or her weed.
So in Victoria, we have taken a slightly different approach. We did have a bill that we put, I think it was Fiona's first act in Parliament when she was re-elected back in 2018, but we never pushed that to debate. What we took to debate instead was a motion to refer cannabis to an inquiry, and it's the first cannabis use inquiry in Australia. And you might think, what's the use of having people sitting around talking about stuff we already know? We know the evidence. We know why we should legalise. What's the use of an inquiry? We've actually had a lot of success in Victoria using that inquiry process and using it as a process to gather evidence and bring the government along with us. So there's 2 pieces of legislation that Reason have referred to inquiry in Victoria. The first being spent convictions, which is a piece which was already enacted in every other state, which takes minor convictions off your criminal record. So, for example, possession of cannabis after a period of time has elapsed. So it's not on your police record haunting you when you go to get jobs. And the other major inquiry that we initiated was voluntary assisted dying. And that inquiry and the conversations from terminally ill patients, family members who had lost their loved ones, the medical professionals that were treating them, that was really, really key in getting the government across the line. And it changed a lot of views, not just from the Labor Party, but also from the Liberal Party as well. It was a conscious vote for everyone. Once the outcomes of that inquiry presented the evidence to show why this reform was necessary, to take the recommendations from that inquiry, and that's where the bill came from. So it's a longer process, but the investment into getting the expert advice or getting the user experiences, we think is really valuable, and it's been quite successful historically. So the reason Fiona can't be here is because she spent the last week in Victoria travelling around. Fiona Patten, I'm so sorry. Fiona Patten, so the leader of the Reason Party. So the reason she cannot be here today is she has been chairing these inquiries in regional Victoria. If you have an opportunity, I really encourage you to go to the Victorian the Victorian Parliament website and have a look at the committees. You will see a whole lot of testimony from a range of health professionals, from users, from advocacy groups, talking about the impact of prohibition and the impact of criminalising cannabis. So things that wouldn't surprise you. It's the most widely used drug in Australia. It clearly demonstrates that prohibition hasn't worked. There's evidence from the ACT talking about how the process of legalisation, it hasn't resulted in an increase in ED visits, or it's decreased the number of arrests, because the only arrests are related to possession. They're not about cannabis-related harm, or there's no violence associated with cannabis use. There's not, theft and other related crimes like there might be with another drug like ice. We're hearing from mental health and psychiatric professionals talking about how it's the process of self-medicating when young people are first developing mental health issues that is causing the problematic use later in life. So that rather than criminalising, investing in investing in mental health and investing in social support and investing in those services that will divert people and delay their use maybe to a little bit later in life, they might not develop problematic use later on. So there's also evidence from users that are talking about the benefit that cannabis brings to their life. There's also some detractors, but overwhelmingly the evidence is in support. So there were over 15,000 submissions. It's the most submissions to any inquiry in the Parliament of Victoria. It was so popular it broke the internet on the first day, or it broke the website, it crashed. We're really hopeful that there'll be some positive recommendations out of that. We can't guarantee that the government will come on board, but it's worked before, so we're hoping it will work again. It will report towards the end of this year, and at least we're hoping to use that to make cannabis one of the number one campaign issues in our 2022 state election.
Thank you. So then turning to Western Australia, to Brian and Sophia, it's exciting to have, and I think quite momentous to have, two newly elected members of Parliament in Western Australia for the Legalise Cannabis Party. How are you moving this forward? What's your plan? How are you going to change things?
How are we going to change things? It's going to be very slow. We're aware of that.
Does it have to be slow though? Is that just what we're told? Because it feels like we've been waiting for a long time. It's already been slow. We can't expedite it?
Well, we've made a big step by actually making it into the upper house in WA.
Well done. Give them a big round of applause for that.
I really can't take credit for that. That really is the team behind us that did all the work there. So in the first meeting that we had with Sue Ellery, which is the Minister for Education in WA, it was very clear that she's not particularly keen on legalising cannabis. However, she also said we're going to be spending the next 4 years together, so let's just play nice together. So that's cool too. But because of all the pushback, I think that we need to do a lot of education, have a lot of research that backs up what we're saying, and slowly break down every counterpoint that they have with really solid evidence that they're wrong about that.
I guess that's... Yes, Brian, did you want to...
Well, I think we have to acknowledge the help we've had from Victoria Reason Party, the Legalise Cannabis in Victoria and New South Wales, and to let you know that it is our intent to steal every word you've got. That's the first point. The second point is that we are still... Our term hasn't yet begun. It's the 24th of May we are sworn in. And the good news is that we are up and running. We're well ahead of the curve. We had some very good fortune in getting things organised. And so when it comes to the new members of Parliament, we're well ahead. So our next step is to strategize exactly how are we going to do that, with taking into account the different approaches in the different states. And you asked the question, does it have to be slow? The answer is we don't know yet. We know who our enemy is, but the trouble is, Sun Tzu, the art of war, you need to know your enemy and know yourself. And we're still finding our feet, because it is our intent to actually smack the enemy off the park. But we need to properly analyse where are we in the Western Australian context. For example, we know that the Labour Party is actually in favour of cannabis legalisation. We know that. Apart, of course, from Mark McGowan, who is the Premier, who is bitterly opposed to it. We've yet to find out why. And he is actually a hated man in his own party, but he's also very well thought of by the general public, and so they can't shift him yet. So these are things which we're looking at, and an important part of our activity is to be very clear as to where our next steps can be, where we can push most effectively, and where it's a waste of our effort in pushing.
Right, thank you, Brian. Thanks. One of the sort of key words that you said before, Sophia, was evidence, and I'm interested how much evidence is starting to change the narrative, particularly in the public, particularly that medical cannabis seems to have moved the public more towards the benefits, not just of cannabis. Cannabis is being a gateway drug, in a sense, philosophically, for other drugs like psilocybin and, MDMA-assisted therapy. Like, how is evidence-based research changing the narrative, and how important is it to reach into the evidence before you go into anecdotal responses? Alex?
Well, I think the first thing to emphasise for all of us, and we should be really much more conscious of this than we have been to date, is that cannabis prohibition itself was based on a lie. And the fundamental, the critical meeting was 1925 League of Nations, so-called Second Opium Commission in Geneva. And cannabis wasn't originally on the agenda of that meeting. It was just opium and cocaine. And then the last minute, cannabis was added to the agenda. No information was distributed to the delegates, but it was maintained at that meeting and accepted by the meeting that cannabis is as dangerous as opium. Now, that is so ridiculous, so monstrously ridiculous. You're talking about evidence. There's tons of evidence against that, no evidence in favour of it. It's just clear wrong. And really on that quicksand was built this mighty edifice of global drug prohibition, which included cannabis. John Ehrlichman, the notorious Watergate conspirator, said to President Nixon in 1971 that cannabis was key to drug prohibition, because if we hold the line on this side of marijuana, as they call it in the United States, we'll be able to keep drug prohibition. And if we lose marijuana, the rest will be at risk. So it is absolutely key. I think we also have to remember, returning to what Brian just said to you about analysing the situation, that there's strong arguments for people in favour of cannabis law reform from each section across the political spectrum. Libertarians, generally on the right of the conservative parties, are strongly in favour. They want more liberty, they want fewer restrictions. There's really no argument amongst them. Then the other conservatives are often fiscal conservatives who want to keep government spending down and want to have low taxes. And many of them see spending on cannabis prohibition as a complete waste of time. And indeed, you're talking about evidence. Finding evidence that cannabis prohibition has benefits is a real challenge. Finding evidence that cannabis prohibition causes serious harm is unfortunately all too easy. And that brings up the third group, the people who get out of bed in the morning because they want to do something for social justice. Well, who cops most of the punishment for cannabis prohibition? Not white men like me, privileged white men like me. It's young people, it's blue-collar people, unemployed people, First Nation people. They're the ones who pay. And so I think we've got a job to convince more of them that this really matters. And then there are people for whom the environment is the driving force of their politics. And how crazy is it to have unregulated cannabis produced by a black market instead of having it mostly produced in a regulated market? So there's strong arguments across the board, and this is a very winnable battle, but it's wrong to think that the battle is going to be won very quickly. These are long, hard battles. They require a lot of persistence, a lot of time, and you're right, we've already taken up a lot of time on this issue. It shouldn't have taken as long as this, but the good news in most social policy battles is that once you start gaining ground, the speed of change accelerates. And we saw that with homosexual law reform. I think we're now starting to see that with the battle about women's policy. Let's hope it's also true with drug law reform. I'm sure it is.
A couple of words, yeah. Sorry. When I introduced the bill into the New South Wales Parliament, the response I got from people, just individuals who were telling me their story about what cannabis has done to their lives or the lives of loved ones in a good way, was extraordinary. So contacted by people, say, 65-year-old couple who has, maybe one of them has just had the most intense pain, say for 15 years, and found cannabis just relieved that. PTSD, of course, like heaps of stories. Often people who had lived with just excruciating pain or mental illness or particularly in terms of PTSD and anxiety and depression for years or decades, had discovered cannabis, whether they're just taking it, buying it off the black market and taking it, or whether they've been prescribed it. So the sharing of, that's the evidence as well, and the sharing of those stories. I've reached out to a few people who contacted me. They said they're willing to kind of share their story. They just come, obviously from all walks of life, but the more that we can tell those stories, I think so many people are hearing about it. I don't know about everybody here, but my social media feed is just well, for obvious reasons, but it is like just full of stories from all across the world about the latest research in terms of the benefits of cannabis. So it's this like, you know, you were just hearing about it being this wonderful plant, not this like, you know, evil thing that we have had to ban for 40 years. Like, it's coming out about, oh my God, this plant is absolutely incredible. It is saving lives. It's making people feel amazing. It's like, you know, getting people off addictive, hideous drugs. Like, let us just get with the program. That's the evidence. People are living it every single day, more and more people. And the best thing about social media is that they're sharing it. So we all kind of know now we're not, you know, people aren't isolated in beautiful little pockets like this anymore.
Thank you so much. Brian?
And if I could add to that as well, I mean, evidence. There is a whole stack of evidence. I don't know how high you can pile it, but it's actually a considerable stack of evidence. Now, one of the advantages that I have, and I'm going to be unashamed about this, because I said earlier, orthodox medicine I don't like at all because of the deficiencies, although there is merit there. But there is a kind of a status associated with being a doctor. Now, it's unjust, because Sophia is an excellent practitioner, but is seen in society as not quite as good as a doctor. Am I correct? However, I am in the upper house of WA, the first doctor since 1948. Now, can you imagine the amount of health laws they have revised, written by people who are not doctors, or legislated upon by people who aren't in the health profession, who have got no clinical experience whatsoever? And here they're going to be asking, where's your evidence for this? And now I can get up as a doctor and tell what's actually happened in my practice, and then lay down a stack of papers there and say, and here's the evidence you have refused to see. And by the way, this is now going to the press upstairs with the précis of what it all means. And the press is going to say, oh my God, why have you hidden this from us? And then we're going to get some movement. But is that part of our strategy? I don't know yet. Sophia, you have to tell me.
Yes, just before we hand over to the audience questions. Yeah, Emma?
I was just going to say, so everyone's in agreement. There's plenty of evidence to support why, and plenty of evidence to support the legalisation, or at least decriminalisation. The problem is, and we see this with climate change, it doesn't matter how much evidence you produce sometimes when there's an innate belief or a conditioned belief that people have had. And, you know, people have been taught from childhood that drugs are bad. If you use drugs, you're a bad person. And if you're asking to legalise drugs, you're asking to, you know, promote all of those stigmas that we talked about before. So I don't know the answer to that, but I think we still need to be aware that when we're arguing evidence versus personal philosophy, it can be really, really difficult to change someone's innate beliefs, and how we go about doing that in a respectful way. I'm not sure exactly what the answer is, but
it is, I think, an incredibly sad indictment of humanity is that we refuse to change our beliefs when confronted with fact. But there we go. That is, in a sense, the human condition, which hopefully we can start to evolve beyond. I'd love to throw open now. We've got about 10 more minutes for questions. So I think we've got some here. We've got someone in the front row.
Hi.
Yep.
I was going to ask the Legalise Cannabis Western Australia candidates, do they have any plans for other forms of drug reform, like maybe an injecting room in Perth or pill testing?
Yes.
At the moment, we're still putting that on the list of things to do. Certainly, one of my passions is to use the other psychedelic drugs. The mind medicine in Australia is doing a fantastic job, and we ought to work with that. It's undoubted there. Harm minimization is one of our things, and you can absolutely show that using cannabis properly will minimize the harm. You're taking people out of the reach of criminals who don't care if it's a 13-year-old you're giving drugs to here, and get them them hooked on amphetamines as well. So harm minimization can definitely be shown. These are all things, absolutely, there's a whole stack of things which we want to look at, not just with drugs, of course, but the whole area of psychosocial and social determinants, which determine how people actually are feeling within a society which doesn't care about those who can't manage things for themselves, who haven't got the money to be able to buy their way out of problems. So it's one of our things we need to do, or many things, and there's a long list of things to put into place.
Thank you. Another question from the audience?
Yeah, Cate, I'd like to ask about, I'll ask you to expand on what your bill does. And the question I'd like to find out is, you mentioned having sort of social clubs. How similar is what you're proposing to what the New Zealanders proposed? They were determining, who got the licence, to have a social club, not just on, say, economic things, but on social equity and the amount of good that was done. So could you sort of expand on that? First of all, your bill, and who would be allowed to get licences to run clubs?
Yeah, thank you. So the Cannabis Authority, which would be established, would determine basically whether people kind of met a fit and proper person test, if you like, to be able to cultivate and sell cannabis. One thing I forgot to mention when I was talking about it before was that the bill would also look at ways in which how to expunge basically all criminal records when it comes to cannabis. Because once it's determined that cannabis isn't problematic and can be legalised and distributed and sold and labelled and taken and used, then we need to say that every single record from the past in terms of cannabis also has to be expunged. And I think we absolutely need that with any bill that legalises this drug. So the Cannabis Authority would look at determining, for example, the labelling, the strain. They'd look at determining and approving cannabis consumption stores, if you like. They would dictate the price as well. We would have, this is kind of a little bit controversial in terms of advertising. What we're trying to not do is kind of bring this big corporate, I just saw, was it yesterday, British American Tobacco, I just read something about, purchasing all these different shares and businesses in cannabis somewhere. I missed where it was. So we wouldn't have advertising. We'd be very clear. That would be, that's really important. So this Cannabis Authority would essentially set a lot of how everything is done. And I think as Greens MPs introducing a bill like this, it's kind of done for several reasons. Firstly, we can't introduce for example, something where we say this is going to cost this much, or we're going to introduce something to get a tax. We can't do that. We're not the government. I'm in the upper house. So to be honest, we had to think a little bit creatively that way, but also trying to give this authority, authority, and away from the government and politics of the day as well. So there's a fair bit of work that it would do in terms of when it was to establish. What's clear is I think there's a lot of interest out there from the industry, from smaller businesses, from growers, stores, cultivators already, who are saying and seeing this as a fantastic kind of model, as in a really good model to start with. And importantly, of course, it still allows people to be able to grow. I said that before, so 6 plants per household of 2, up to 12 plants if there's more than 2 adults in the household. And then there's this kind of really exciting thing, which is the social clubs aspect. interestingly, just a little aside, with the social clubs aspect of it, I heard David Halpern last session talking about Clubs New South Wales and pokies and the influence of pokies and alcohol on potentially our whole drug regime. Clubs New South Wales, because I have the portfolio of poker machines and gambling as well, Clubs New South Wales contacted me after I introduced the bill saying, "Oh, Cate, we really want to talk to you about your legalised cannabis bill. We're really excited about this and see a huge potential for us in the cannabis clubs, social clubs you're talking about." It's like, no, mate. No, they're not those types of clubs. Like, I think Clubs New South Wales is going to stay well away from any social clubs that start.
I would.
Can you imagine?
That would be a much...
Play the pokies and, smoke your...
I was just thinking of getting like having the bistro.
Yeah.
At that cannabis club
Bingo.
would be a lot better. And I do love the fact we have a lot of cannabis authorities at this festival, but I just love, that would be such a great job to get, wouldn't it? There'd be a lot of very proud.
Yeah, I think there are a number of people on it though. It isn't like the cannabis czar, that dictates.
Yes.
Yeah, that would be a very, very, very highly competitive role.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think we have a question over here, and that will be the last one, I think, for this session. Thank you.
We're way behind the 8 ball in regards to medical cannabis in Australia when we look at the global village around us, and they've, moved forward in leaps and bounds. So we've obviously got, plenty of role models to emulate that are doing it right, and it's enormously propping up economics in communities and infrastructure of places like in Canada, and can just keep going and going. Really makes us scratch our heads why we're so way behind. But there is a question of appropriation, like with anything, like with alcohol. There's nothing essentially wrong, in my view, with alcohol, but it's the use of alcohol and how it has been widespread without any framework. So it's become a crutch that's legally condoned as a social, whatever. Would it be appropriate to contextualise the use of what is the difference between medical cannabis and the appropriation of the use of cannabis? Because you're going to end up with a lot of people that just going, yeah, medical cannabis, and they, wake up with a bong and end up with a bong, and they're all day bonging, and they're all, it's complete. It's a crutch,
So how do we navigate that space? I guess, in the way that cannabis is perceived as a medical and as a recreational? Is that what we're talking about there?
Yes, and also, some sort of framework for that. So we have elders, so to speak, or people with embodied knowledge and experience to share the guidelines of how to use cannabis and other enormously helpful plant spirit medicines.
Oh, okay. I see.
Enormously.
The phrase. So maybe we'll throw to Emma just to answer the question around the framework, particularly coming from wisdom of people that have been using cannabis while it's prohibited, and other plant medicines.
So, I guess when you kind of talk about, excuse me if I'm getting this wrong. So when you were talking about, medicinal cannabis turning into someone just reaching out and grabbing a bong in the morning, is that?
Well, depends what the legal status is. If it becomes decriminalised and not allowed,
but aren't we also looking at the point where we're destigmatising? So that whole idea of someone that, it is that thing of that there's an inherent sense that, someone might reach out and grab a bong in the morning, but that may be their recreational use, and that's completely okay. So do we need framework around that?
Well, I don't know if it's a framework. I think it's people being honest about their drug use, and it's not just people, it's not just your stereotypical user, it's not just people that are using medicinally. drugs are used in all spectrums of Australian society. So it's people like Cate getting up as a politician and saying that, putting her hand up and saying that she uses drugs. It's people that work in corporate environments that use drugs on the weekend, being honest about that. It's people stopping bullshitting, basically, and being honest about who they are, and not creating a stigma of something that isn't real, because they're actually engaging in that activity as well. I'm not sure if you can have a framework around it, but I think we need to create safe environments where people can put their hand up and not have consequences.
Yeah, I guess one of the places we didn't get to in this conversation was around the moving from a criminalised kind of framework to viewing through health, and looking to sort of, addiction and treatment models, which obviously it's hard to sort of navigate all of that. I'll start to bring this to a close. The other area I sort of wanted to delve into, but we didn't get to, we just touched on slightly. We talked about the black market, and I guess we have to be cautious of moving forward with decriminalisation and legalisation, that we don't, in a sense, fall prey to what's happened, as we see, as Cate was saying, with alcohol, where it's become a very corporate model, where we also have to acknowledge that within the black market there have been some incredible people working on the ground level, doing great acts of good in a system at great risk. The Hemp Embassy being one of them. The major one. I did get a phone call from a friend of mine who died. He had a brain tumour. He had been he'd been off drugs and alcohol. He was a long-standing injecting drug user who'd spent something like 15 years in a prison in Thailand. He got clean. And eventually had a brain tumour, rang me because he was living on the Gold Coast, and he said, he said, I've got this brain tumour. I've been in NA now for, 15 years or something. And he goes, I can't believe now I'm having to go score drugs again. He goes, can you get me some, this was about 10 years ago, so can you get me some medical cannabis? Because I'm going to die. And I said, okay, I'll ring up the Hemp Embassy. So I rang the Hemp Embassy, and the guy answers, he goes, I said, hello, my name's Mandy Nolan. I'm ringing on behalf of my friend who's got a brain tumour, and I'm wondering if you can help me with I didn't know what to say, with some medical cannabis to ease his dying. And the guy goes, look, Michael's in jail at the moment, so he can't help you. And I went, oh, no. And he goes, yeah, but I reckon I could. Look, if you come in and just bring your own marijuana. And I actually had a tear in my eye, because I thought, wow, I just loved how disruptive that was. I thought that was actually really kind and compassionate, with no real concern for their own personal safety, because I could have been a cop. I'm just going to head quickly to Brian before we close.
Just a quick word here about...
You can try mine.
No, they're all working now.
No, they're all working. You can't have
just
mine.
A quick word here about the framework. My personal point of view, and I'm sorry, Sophia, for taking time away from you. My personal point of view is that we should make cannabis as legal as alcohol and tobacco and coffee and sugar. So the question, that's the first thing. The second thing is, how do you use this? I mean, you could say after a hard day, you've taken, let's say, a glass of sherry at night or whatever, because it calms you, helps you sleep, widens the arteries in the brain so you get better sleep. That's a medicinal use of alcohol, but using that under your free agency. Cannabis itself, you can use this most doctors who use cannabis now are orthodox doctors. You come in with a headache, here, have some cannabis. You come in with a headache, here, take some Panadine Forte. What's the cause of the headache? Couldn't give a shit. Next patient, please. That's orthodox medicine for you. Whereas the cannabis user really ought to be looking at the cause, what's actually going on. I am having a headache because I am deeply stressed because of. And then I'm going to use the cannabis to apply a treatment while I am engaging in neuro-linguistic programming or hypnotherapy to fix the problem. And cannabis can give me the peace I need to enable that course of action to be taken. That's a more functional medicine approach. We absolutely must get away from the orthodox idiocy of here's a diagnosis, there's a pill or a potion.
Thank you very much, Brian. And we really do need, it's very clear, hopefully when we sit here next year and talk about drug law reform, there's been some huge changes. And thank you for you five here for being part of the kind of the people at that level that are pioneering that and that are pushing that. Please thank Cate Faehrmann, Sophia Moermond, Emma Sinclair, Dr. Brian Walker and Dr. Alex Wodak. Thank you.